Aloha, everyone. Welcome back for those returning for the final evening of the Buddhist Study Center 2020 summer session. And aloha for those attending for the first time. I'm Dexter Marr, and I'll be your summer session moderator. For those joining for the first time, thank you for participating in the 46th annual Buddhist Study Center summer session. For those who have attended previously, we hope you've been learning something about the global migration of Buddhism, and in particular, the evolution of Buddhism into an American religious and spiritual form. The technology we're using is a combination of YouTube and Skype. So viewers are in a broadcast mode viewing like a live TV program, and the virtual studio is from Skype. So the only direct interaction from you, the audience, to Sensei Williams is via the chat mode in YouTube. So look below your screen for something that looks like Top Chat, and you can type in your questions and comments via chat at any time, and we will select questions from there for questions and answers. The sooner you submit your questions, the more likely Duncan will be able to reply. Also, please give Duncan feedback on his presentation. With YouTube, he cannot see any of you and get an impression of your response. So your chat responses are really helpful. This presentation will be immediately available on YouTube. So if you need to break away, portions or the entirety can be viewed at a later time. The format of the evening is going to be the same as the previous 4 nights, with about 40 minutes of presentation by Duncan, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. Then a 10-minute break for home refreshment, stretching, etc. In this break, we'll be showing a video of folding origami cranes. And so for those of you that have never folded a crane, it's an opportunity for you to learn how to fold a crane, which is an important symbol for what we're going to be talking about tonight. If you want to be folding, you need to find about a 6-inch by 6-inch piece of paper to fold. So you can try to do that in the first hour. Okay. A full syllabus of the homework is available on the BSC website. There are a couple different readings tonight. One is called Making Paper Cranes Fly. It's a report from Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and interview with Ashok Mukpo from Tricycle magazine from the current version, summer of 2020. And so these are very readable and available right now if you want to go to the website. So please bear with us at the Buddhist Study Center as we learn how to produce and make these types of educational programs and the technology required. We selected the YouTube Skype approach for the ease of your connecting via YouTube without complicated sign-ons, as well as the Skype is a pretty reliable connection for the BSC studio. So I will not repeat my introduction of Sensei Williams, but refer you back to the materials at the Buddhist Study Center website. Last night we learned about a Buddhist perspective on our relationship with the natural world and how we might view our stewardship and responsibilities. Tonight, Sensei Williams will focus on our relationships with each other and what a Buddhist action might be in Interlinked, Social Engagement 2020. So Duncan, over to you.
Thank you, Dexter, for your kind remarks. As he mentioned, tonight is the last night, so thank you if you have been keeping up with each evening's seminar and the readings and so forth. I'm hoping to connect what we talked about last night and the night before about social engagement. Yesterday we talked about it in terms of environmental issues. Tonight I want to turn to some of the other big I'm just communicating with the study center control center, and what I want to do tonight is focus our attention on some of these topics that have been coming up in recent times about our nation, who belongs, what is the nature of racial justice, these type of topics. And to do that, I want to start with a video, and I'm going to ask the Buddhist Study Center to see if we can run a short video that I think will help us frame our first hour of conversation. Hi, everybody. I'm not quite sure if the video showed in full, but hopefully you got a sense of this group of people who went out to Oklahoma to participate in a Buddhist style engagement with a social issue of our time. I'm now going to share my screen and go back like we've done in the past with talking through some slides in this first hour about this topic for tonight, a Buddhist approach to racial justice. And so obviously we've been talking about engaged Buddhism yesterday and the experience of Buddhists during World War II, especially Japanese American Buddhists who were incarcerated and faced things like unjust deportation, family separation, and indefinite incarceration. And but I never thought I would personally be going out and organizing a group of clergy to support a group called Tsuru for Solidarity, a Japanese American organization. I never thought I'd be involved in that until I received, out of the blue, a email from a friend of mine up in the San Francisco Bay Area, Nancy Ukai. I had known her as one of the founders of this important Japanese American World War II project called 50 Objects, about showing and telling and educating people through artifacts from World War II. But and I had also known her as the president of the of the Berkeley chapter of the JACL, or the Japanese American Citizens League. But she had actually been one of the early people involved in Tsuru for Solidarity, along with people like Satsuki Ina and Mike Ishii and Carl Takei. There's some wonderful community leaders in the Japanese American community, and Nancy was one of them. And she suddenly sent me an email, and in the subject line were the words Sutra Cranes. And what I learned from her was that she was part of the first direct action of a group of Japanese Americans, some of them camp survivors, some of them descendants of the World War II camps, who had become, in the spring of last year, increasingly concerned about what was happening on the southern border, what was happening with people seeking refuge and asylum on a legal basis, fearing violence and persecution, but who weren't being given the opportunity per normal to have an expedited review of their case, being put in indefinite incarceration in substandard, inhumane conditions without any beds, with lack of hygienic products. And I think worst of all, hearing the news of children being separated from their families, these unaccompanied minors who were in large numbers, thousands, being put in separate facilities from their families. And I think that resonated with many Japanese American camp survivors and their descendants, because their families had experienced that type of separation. If you were, for example, if you recall 2 days ago, I mentioned Reverend Kenko Yamashita. I mentioned many other Buddhist priests who were taken away from their families. And this kind of family separation program from back in World War II was eerily reminiscent of what seemed to be happening today as an actual policy to encourage the deterrence of people coming in large numbers across the southern border. And so this was something that they felt very strongly about. And I had heard, I had, just like everybody else, read about these kind of things in the news. But it wasn't until I received that email from Nancy, where she mentioned that a group of people, including our friend and colleague up in San Francisco, Reverend Ron Kobata, had gone together to a place called Dilley, Texas. They had gone to the nearby Crystal City internment camp initially to remember that World War II camp. And Reverend Kobata did a Buddhist ceremony there to recall that past. But then they interlinked that with a trip and a protest to a place called the South Texas Residential Family Center in nearby Dilley. And there they placed on the fence of this ICE detention center with 1,000, I think at that time it was about, 2,000, over 2,000 children who had been separated from their families. They had placed paper origami cranes on that fence. And it was for them a show of witness, really, a show of solidarity and support for those children, for all of these people who were experiencing indefinite incarceration, family separation, and unjust deportment, like people back in World War II among the Japanese American community had also faced. The group, I think, had originally made an appeal to many different Japanese American groups and others, allies, to make like, I think their goal and dream was to make 10,000 cranes that they could place around this ICE detention center fence, with the thought that, back in World War II, not very many people kind of spoke up for the Japanese Americans. We talked 2 nights ago about some people like Roy Loggins. We talked about Julius Goldwater, Ernest Hunt. There were, of course, some people who stood up for the Japanese Americans, but there was no mass protest or show of concern. And so the idea was, in a Japanese American fashion, to make, origami cranes has a history, because the cranes represent so much in the way of, in Japanese culture, the idea of transformation and hopefulness and flying into freedom. And so there was this idea of making these cranes, and of course there's a link to Sadako and Hiroshima, and kind of making cranes to try to, embed in the crane making a prayer for a better, more peaceable future. And so they had hoped for 10,000, and they received well over, I think, double or even triple that number of cranes as they went to Texas to make that statement that we are in solidarity with all of you inside this confinement site, even if you may or may not be able to directly witness that we would be the witnesses in that situation. And so I learned about this amazing group of people who were linking their history, community history, with something happening today, with the message of, if we are talking about not trying to repeat the mistakes and the failures of leadership, failures of the imagination in the past, and we're not trying to repeat that history, that when we say never forget, that moment about never forgetting is actually happening right now. And so I was very, very inspired by this group, but I myself hadn't had you remember we talked about this word goen, this kind of interlinked kind of like karmic condition or reason to directly get involved in some direct action like this. And that only came when that email landed in my inbox. And what that subject line, Sutra Cranes, meant was that Nancy had taken some colored photocopies of, I guess, the front cover of my book, American Sutra, and used that paper to make these colorful, wonderful cranes and place them on that fence in Dilley, Texas. And for me, that was my kind of like karmic connection. Sometimes I feel like it's like I became an accidental activist, just like back in, when I started American Sutra, when I came across that diary, I became an accidental Japanese American like history buff. But in this case, on a deeper level, it's not really accidental, but rather some kind of deep, mysterious kind of karmic condition that got me interested. Just like when I saw that diary for the first time 18 years ago, I didn't know that much and had to educate myself about the whole World War II Japanese American experience and what role Buddhism played in that. And this time too, I didn't really know that much about ICE policies, what's the difference between them and Border Patrol, and what are different kinds of detention facilities and who manages them. And there's a lot of things I had to learn about. But as I learned more and more, I became inspired to be involved. And that's when we learned this news about the fact that some of those children in Texas were being scheduled to be transferred to a location in Oklahoma, a current and former U.S. Army base, Fort Sill. It's an Army base, but I think the Marine Corps also uses that base to do field artillery practice and training. And I had heard about it only because one of my friends who had served in the Marine Corps had spent some time there. And I'd also known about this place because it was, in fact, back in World War II, in the spring of 1942, one of the internment camps that held Japanese nationals as well as Japanese Panamanians and so forth, about 700 of them for a period in the spring of 1942. So it wasn't one of the really well-known famous camps like Manzanar or Tula Lake or Heart Mountain, but it was one of the smaller places that was serving as an internment camp for a shorter period of time. And yet, in that short period of time, I learned from my own research for American Sutra, looking at the translation of diaries and memoirs by the priests. If you recall from 2 nights ago, Reverend Takahashi Seitsu, the bishop and head Buddhist priest of the Koyasan Temple, he wrote about this place back in World War II. He wrote about the fact that when they got there, it was so dusty and windy, and they didn't have, they weren't allowed to reside in the barracks, but they were given these temporary tents, and the wind was so strong it blew away. He talked about the fact that they wouldn't, unlike these other camps that they had been in, they weren't provided with like toothpaste and soap. And he had a lot of comments about the difficulty of spending time in this particular internment camp. But one of the things that he also mentioned in his diary, and other Buddhist priests also mentioned in their recollections of their time there, was a Buddhist funeral officiated by 90 Buddhist priests. So if you can imagine, the total population of the internees, 700, of them, 90 were, almost like 1 out of 7 of them were Buddhist priests. And when there was an incident at the fence line of Fort Sill, when one of the people from Hawaii, yesterday, I think at the very end, I mentioned there was a question in the chat from Reverend Jiko Nakade from Kona Daifukuji Temple. It was actually her grandfather who was the person at that fence line at Fort Sill who, yearning to come home, yearning to reconnect with his wife and 11 children that he left behind in Kona, Hawaii. He was at that fence line and was seen as suspicious and seen as somebody making potentially an attempt to escape the internment camp, and he was shot in the back of the neck, back of the head by one of the sentries or armed guards. And so I knew about that history, and I knew about the fact that he and actually 2 other people, there were 3 of them who died. Another one also killed by a guard, and somebody else who died of a medical condition. But there were 3 people in that very short period of time who passed away at Fort Sill. And this group of Buddhist priests got together, overcame whatever sectarian differences they may have had, and performed a ceremony to remember them. And so for all of those reasons, I felt like I needed to go to this place called Fort Sill, where these kids were going to be taken. And I joined this wonderful group of leaders and activists and people concerned and willing to take time to go out to a place like Fort Sill, Oklahoma, to register their concern. And so I joined them then, and some months later, I went a second time, this time motivated to also organize other Buddhist people to participate and join this wonderful organization called Tsuru for Solidarity by making cranes. And I put out an appeal last Independence Day before Independence Day, to do some kind of crane making so that Buddhist sanghas would also be involved in making cranes and having some kind of show of prayer and concern that we could take to these ICE detention facilities. And so, as a shorthand, I call it Fort Sill 2. That should actually say July, but 2019. A group of us went, and you can see different people who participated. My colleagues from Little Tokyo in Los Angeles, Buddhist clergy of different denominations, Shingon, somebody who came out, who's a descendant of Reverend Takahashi's temple, and the abbot of the temple that Reverend Yamashita from back in World War II. I mentioned him yesterday about his interment where his wife wasn't taken because she was pregnant with a child. So all these people who are connected in different ways to this history. Reverend William Briones from the Los Angeles Honpa Hongwanji Betsuin. He's a Mexican-American, third generation. His grandparents crossed the border without papers, serving now at a historic Japanese-American temple. He had that kind of personal feeling that of wishing to be involved. And from Hawaii, we were sent these special lei, the Maila lei from Reverend Jiko Nakade from Kona Daifukuji. And you can see Reverend Nakao and myself in this moment before we're at the fence, ready to go to offer them at that fence in a ceremony. And so we were joined by many different groups, Zen centers and other Buddhist groups from around the country, Thich Nhat Hanh's Engaged Buddhism community and so forth. And we were also joined by local Oklahoma Buddhist sanghas as well. And so together with our friends from Student for Solidarity and also our friends from an organization called United We Dream, a youth kind of oriented group, young people, high schoolers and some college students, primarily Latinx dreamers or people who are in the United States based on DACA and that they had, again, like so many others, come into the country as children without papers and yet very much a part of American life and society. I've had in my own classroom many dreamers in my classes at USC as well as UC Berkeley. And so I was so impressed with these young people who had so much energy. And us Buddhist priests, I think none of us were that used to participating in protests, but we had our own kind of I think solemnity and dignity that we brought to the occasion. And so together we participated in a protest as well as a ceremony right by the fence at Fort Sill, a ceremony where the young people quietened down and solemnly allowed our Buddhist service to resonate in the air so that we could offer those Hawaii lei so that we could offer our memorial service to Kanesaburo Oshima and all of the other people who died in that camp back in World War II. And what we ended up doing was afterwards going to a nearby park, setting up another altar. I had the opportunity to bring a Buddha that had been carved out of wood in Manzanar, and it's a wonderful treasure held at Zenshuji Temple in Los Angeles, and they allowed me to bring it. And we also made these Buddhist, they're sometimes called toba, or these kind of like memorial tablets with the names of those who had passed away back then, but also the names of children. At that time, it was like 7 or 8 children, and now it's well over a dozen children who have died in the custody of ICE and the Border Patrol. And so that's the kind of ceremony we did, and we made these tablets for everyone. And then we invited the young people and other people who had joined. There were members from the American Indian movement, from Black Lives Matter, and all kinds of different church groups, Christian groups, and others who joined us in this Buddhist ceremony, where they wrote a name of somebody they wanted remembered, who had experienced now or in the past, you know, whether it's indefinite incarceration, unjust deportment, or family separation, anybody that they wanted to recall, they wrote these names, and we Buddhist priests recited them, remembered them as part of this interlinked community remembrance ceremony. And so that's one way that we thought we would like to participate as Buddhists in this movement. You know, other people are probably far more adept at coming up with like how to influence policy in DC and do lobbying efforts. Maybe others are more adept at how direct action and civil disobedience work, and others might be more apt at actually, you know, doing the work of helping families as they reunite or come out of ICE detention and providing sanctuary work for them. There's lots of different ways that people can get involved, and lots of different ways people probably have to get involved. But we try to get involved coming out of our own kind of Buddhist tradition, trying to bring something, values, ceremony, teachings, ritual, that have resonance and meaning for us into that kind of situation, so that we could also, authentic to ourselves, try to lend our voice of concern and protest as well. So this is basically what I wanted to say in this first half. I know we had I hope a little video from before about how we actually looked like when we went to Oklahoma. But during some point of today's workshop, I also wanted to have a little bit more of an interactive with you. Dexter mentioned, I think at the top, that if possible, just even for your own, just having a crane that's around you, to actually use our hands to fold cranes and do something. So I know many of you actually may be quite skilled at making cranes already, but during the transition to the second part, we wanted to run a video that showed how to fold a crane on your own. But before we go into that, I do want to go back to the studio and see if Dexter may have some questions for me. I have another whole section I want to talk about, which is related to what has come up since that time when we went to Fort Sill, and talk a little bit about not only the fact that our actions seem to have actually had some consequence where the children weren't moved to this former World War II internment camp. I think the publicity for the new Oklahoma governor and the U.S. senator representing Oklahoma, I think they they didn't want that kind of negative public attention about one of their army bases being used to house these children. And so, and the policy itself has been modified in some respects since then. And so usually you don't expect, when you engage in this kind of, work that, elides a little bit into policy making or politics and that kind of thing. You don't do it directly so that, you do one action and you expect, everything to be resolved and solved to your point of view directly, or the next, in some immediate kind of causative way. But in this particular case, it seems like those various actions by the Japanese Americans, by the Native Americans, by Black Lives Matter, by these Latinx dreamers and many others, these liberal white church groups, like a lot of different people came together, activists from many different traditions, seem to have put enough attention on this situation to have made a difference. But the basic underlying situations continue. And I think those of you who have been hearing the news may have heard just a few hours ago, there was a alert on the New York Times that children who have been separated from their families would be allowed to leave some of these ICE detention facilities because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and how putting children who arrived at the southern border after this arduous journey, now being placed in a lockdown situation in incarceration sites that have very little, it was already substandard hygiene to begin with. It becomes a breeding ground for COVID-19, and a judge ruled that the children should be released. So we do have here and there some positive news, especially around the children. But unfortunately, when it comes to the adults and many others who are in incarcerated situations, their realities are very much affected by the ways in which it's so hard to maintain physical distancing and so on in these type of confinement sites. And so anyway, I just wanted to mention some of these things before in the second half, talking about what I've been trying to do since, which is there was a major protest being organized by this group, Tsuru for Solidarity, in Washington, D.C. for June the 6th. At that time, we had hoped to make 125,000 of these cranes to take with us to Washington, D.C. to represent, every person of Japanese ancestry who had been incarcerated back in World War II, and to make also mariposa or butterflies to represent all the people who have been incarcerated in Border Patrol and ICE detention facilities in recent years. And we were going to take them to Washington, D.C. and place them not on a ICE detention facility fence, but on the fence of the White House. And that was our major plan as part of something called the National Pilgrimage to close the camp. So there was going to be caravans that went across, going to ICE detention facilities, going to former World War II detention facilities, and we were going to be taking these cranes and so forth. Unfortunately, because of COVID-19, of course, that didn't happen. And so in the latter half, I want to talk about what we did instead, and how after COVID-19, we also began to notice that interlinking was happening on so many levels. It wasn't just about what happened during World War II and what's happening on the border or in ICE detention facilities. It wasn't just that after COVID-19 began to be associated by politicians with some kind of association with being Chinese or Asian. These words like kung fu and the China virus and so on. So that language that prompted so much in the way of harassment of people, telling people to go back home, and all of these incidents that happened against Asian people, the anti-Asian kind of COVID-19 racism and incidents that have been documented by groups like the Center for Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University. We've been noting around the country all of these incidents that remind us of what happened in World War II right after Pearl Harbor, where Japanese people were spit on, told to go home, harassed, attacked violently in the days after the Pearl Harbor attack. And so all of this scapegoating that's been happening, and of course, after the protests from Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor, all of that protest and attention on anti-Black racism and these structural problems we've had that have been just enduring problems. We tried to do something that would interlink and connect all of that on June 6th. So that's what I want to talk about in the second half, how we as Buddhists, again, not from, I think we can all participate in the usual activities of writing letters to our representatives or voting or expressing our concerns and becoming involved in noting things both on a political level in our families, in our communities, and so forth. But I also wanted to bring up today this idea that maybe we should also add a layer of perspective, a framework from a Buddhist perspective, because once you get involved in all these things, I think it's easy to get burned out. There's so many issues. Yesterday we talked about global climate change. Today we're talking about racial justice. There's so many different issues, and I sometimes think about it like there's a mountain of suffering and an ocean of tears. And once one starts to notice the social and ecological suffering out there, it can feel overwhelming. And so I think Buddhism teaches us how to handle that. There's been lots of centuries of teaching about how to get perspective, how to have compassion, and how to engage with each other in relationship. And so those are the type of things I want to also bring up in the second half, and then talk a little bit more about what I've been involved with more recently. So with that, maybe I could return to the studio and see if there are questions that Dexter can share with me.
Sure. Thank you, Duncan. I'm wondering if the video that you wanted to show at the beginning is available. David, is that possible, or is that not something we'll be able to show? Okay. 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 Well, we'll hold off on a second for that, but I do have one interesting question for you, Duncan.
Yes.
It says, how do you reconcile the Buddhist concept of non-judgment and activism?
That's a great question. I'll probably want a moment to think about it, but of course, the idea of having a positionality, having a mindset, a still mind that is capable of seeing multiple positions, that is capable of feeling the suffering of others, but without necessarily placing labels or judgments on X, Y, or Z. uh, that's actually a very, very useful tool to have in one's toolkit of engagement with the world. So it's actually, it's not that that's a binary of something called non-judgment and something called activism. Non-judgment is one of many tools that the Buddha gave us as a teaching, as a perspective, as a position that actually helps us to activate. Yesterday, I talked about, and the day before too, the thematic continues, this idea that, whenever we talk about values, whenever we talk about ideals and aspirations, whether they're Buddhist ones, like, the idea of, we have the 6 paramitas, or like, values like patience, values like compassion and loving kindness, that, all of those things, they're just words unless we activate them, unless we engage them in real situations. And I think one of the lessons of the World War II camps is that it's when you're pushed to the limit, when your situation is most precarious and dire, it's those moments that our practice has to activate the most, And so, to me, activism is not a contradiction to being still, being able to see things non-judgmentally. But in fact, that ability is a key one in many kinds of crucial moments. The ability to see things without having some kind of prejudgment or prejudice. That's a very important mindset to bring to whatever kind of activity, engagement, social, ecological, or otherwise, that we might be engaged in. That said, one of the ideas I often talk about is that there are many different kinds of ways that one can conceive of activism. It's not like if you aren't on a protest march, you aren't active. It was kind of like related to the story yesterday about maybe doing something about the disposable plastic and chopsticks at the temple gatherings. It's not like you have to be like some kind of like extinction, whatever, active, like you can, there's many different ways of involvement. And as I was saying, because of our interlinked net, every action has responsibility and consequences, and we can bring the right values and mindset to that action. And I often recall when I was a young monk, and I was gone to Japan, but also I was also visiting American Buddhist, Zen Buddhist monasteries. There was one in upstate New York called Zen Mountain Monastery, and I spent a month there when I was like 18 years old for their December, it's called winter sesshin, or the kind of intensive meditation. And as I was there, one of the other people who was in the community was this really young boy, really. He's, I think, 15, 16 years old, max. And he was there not because he wanted to be there, but because he had been involved in some break-ins and theft. I think not major theft, but like breaking into people's homes, stealing, and so on. And the local juvenile court judge said, you can either go to some kind of special juvenile hall or be put away for some time in that kind of special facility for minors, or you can go and spend that time in some kind of religious facility. And I think the judge was probably thinking a Christian, like monastery or seminary or something like that. But the parents put him in this place called Zen Mountain Monastery. And the abbot of the monastery was giving a talk about how to engage your compassion in the world. And he was talking about there are many different ways that you can be an activist or activate your compassion in real familial, community, and social, ecological situations. But then he looked at the young boy and said, but you know, for some people, just sitting really still, that's a huge contribution to the world. Because every night that this boy is sitting with us silently, not doing anything like breaking into people's homes, terrorizing people in home invasion, like that is actually a huge contribution he's making by not doing anything, right? So that's a form of activism too, sometimes, okay? That I think from a Buddhist perspective, it's not like there's only one right form, but rather there are a huge multiplicity of forms that we, depending on our karmic situation, may want to engage. So I just mentioned that as one way to think about this issue of being able to sometimes have this still mind, non-judgmental mind, but also having the wisdom to discern things, having the wisdom to discern what direction to move in is also a really important Buddhist ability inside of our toolkit that the Buddha provides for us. So activism, engagement, putting your practice into reality of family, community, society, ecology requires using different tools. And the last image I'm going to end with is the image of the 1,000-armed kannon. I don't have a visual to give to you, but if you can imagine, you know, in Japanese Buddhist monasteries, there's a lot of these kannon with 11 heads or 1,000 arms. Why? Because bodhisattvas are supposed to be able to attend to the hearing all of the different cries of suffering in the world, having many different tools in their many different hands to be able to offer different kinds of assistance whenever and whatever is required. And so to me, that's also part of it. You have that core of non-judgment. You have that core of trying to, in fact, release all these prejudices and prejudgments that we tend to carry around with ourselves. And as we release and empty ourselves of all of those presumptions, assumptions, prejudices, so for sure, that is an important Buddhist tool and one of those arms of the bodhisattva. But another arm might have that, you know, sword of Manjushri, the ability to cut through delusion, understand what is correct and incorrect in a particular situation. That kind of judgment is actually a Buddhist kind of judgment that we have to be able to make at any moment and take whatever karmic consequences come with that. So that's another part of the story too, that we have actually multiple hands, multiple tools in our hands from our Buddhist tradition about how we might engage all of this, keeping our values intact.
Thank you, Duncan. I'll let you take a second to read some of the chats. I'm reminded of Bishop-elect Marvin Harada's article that made an impression on me once, that it was entitled "Do Something." And, it's maybe not, it doesn't have to be those big things. It can be, whatever you can think of, at the moment. And also that that the Buddha, after his enlightenment, he was trying to decide whether he should, just stay in his warm cocoon of realization and had to be persuaded, to go out and share his teachings. So I think from the get-go, Buddhism has this tradition of activism. Yeah.
Right. So I think that is, we that's why in Buddhism we have something called noble silence, right? There is that place deep within that is a noble and silent one. But for example, Zen Master Dogen always liked to say, kind and proper words can turn, this is in the reading for today, I think I quoted Zen Master Dogen as saying, just the right turning words can turn the course of a nation. That's how much power sometimes even just the right words might have. So when we talk to our friends, our family, our neighbors, our politicians, our policymakers, sometimes having the right words that can impact and affect that situation, that's a really important medicine that we can bring to the world. Just like, as Dexter said, the Buddha brought medicine to the world. He could have just continued to be quiet, but he felt compelled out of that noble silence to come and say something, do something, right? So we balance that back and forth. There's a joke, I guess, in the Zen Buddhist community. There's that, don't just sit there, do something. And then we have these mug cups that say, don't just do something, sit there. And so, we have all of these multiplicity of tactics. And what I tried to get at, I guess, 2 nights ago with that phrase, skillful adaptation, or in Japanese, hoben, or in Sanskrit, upaya, we need to adapt, we need to adjust, we need to find the appropriate ways of connecting with each other. And it's not just one thing. I think there's a comment in the chats I see from LC Lum. I think how each of us express our social engagement as Buddhists is a very personal decision depending on who we are and our own karmic conditions. I mean, how true. It's not like there's one, only one way to engage and participate. Sharon Tanaka talks about assisting in DACA causes or immigrant and Black Lives Matter movements. I'm going to be talking about some of that in the second half. But in terms of a general approach, to me, like it's when we can see people as having a shared basic ability as sentient beings to want, to have a sense of refuge and belonging, have a place of safety, and so it's not that hard to I think feel that we if we were in that same situation, let's say our parents brought us over the border without papers, and we had just grown up in whatever town or city if we can put ourselves into interconnected reality, I think that's the first step for how we might connect. And I think the next step is really just connecting with, not theoretically, but with real people who are in those situations. And again, sometimes the best work is not done publicly. It's not done in a showy, I'm in a protest kind of mode, but it's done in a quiet way where we are talking to our friends who might be undocumented, or talking to our friends who are active in Black Lives Matter or other kinds of social, racial or police justice movements, and just not necessarily showing in some kind of performative way that we are in solidarity with them, but quietly having ways of connecting with people from different types of backgrounds and communities. That's a very important aspect of things as well. And I see there's also a comment from Penny Atchison that the Hawaii Betsuin BWA sent at least 200 cranes with Reverend Kobata to take to that. I think she's referring to the Dili event, and of course many sanghas in Hawaii also sent cranes for Fort Sill 2 as well. So that was one way, I think, for, as LC Lum was saying, there are many ways that you can do it. Making cranes and participating in that particular thing happened to be one avenue that I think many people felt was a way that maybe, even if you lived far from the southern border of the United States, that you didn't have that kind of connection with folks in Texas or Oklahoma or anything like that, you could make a crane, you know, and in every fold have a prayer that was about saying, I feel something that is expressed by the making of this crane. And so I think when people feel helpless or people feel like I can't affect anything or do anything, sometimes what we need to do is offer a method, a smart set of tools that allow people to start engaging. And the cranes was one way to do so.
So this is a...
I think we hit the 9 o'clock point, so I'm going to turn back to Dexter, and maybe he can give us some guidance about how we're going to use the next few minutes.
Okay, yeah, it's a perfect segue, to for doing something. Part of this has been to make cranes, and we're going to play the folding the crane how-to video, during the break. And so if you have not had your chance to make cranes, these are cranes that Faye and I made at the Japanese Cultural Center of Hawaii at the Tsuru, for Solidarity event back in February, just before the epidemic occurred. And so that's a little something that you can do. For those of you that are veteran, crane makers, you can take your break and come back in about 10 minutes. And also, I just wanted to point out my backdrop is my Buddhist flags, and my American flag is a shout out to Duncan, for as he had mentioned earlier this week that he had just become an American citizen, and so the American Buddhist symbology here for you to celebrate our final evening together.
Thank you, Dexter.
So, David, are you ready to try to play that video? Well, welcome back, everyone. And Duncan is ready to complete, the marathon and give us some, hopefully, some wise words of how we can become more active and proactive. So, Duncan, it's all yours.
Thank you, Dexter. And I want to acknowledge and apologize for those who are trying to make the cranes for the first time. The video, usually when we show it, people are able to pause and stop and restart and so forth. When you run it just through, the instructions go by pretty quickly, even though they're fairly clear. They go by quickly, and I know that was hard to follow if that was your first time trying to make a origami crane in like 2.5 minutes. And so please, in your own pace, look up, there are quite a few videos on YouTube on how to make cranes, and find the one that works for you in terms of the pacing, and if you can control the stops and starts for how to make it. I think that should work. So now I just want to continue, as Dexter said, to kind of like bring it full circle. He mentioned, and I see it in his background, that merging of Buddhism and the American flag. And as he mentioned, recently, June the 19th to be exact, I became a U.S. citizen. And in fact, I want to try to integrate that in how I'm going to end tonight. But let me just note to the control center that I'm going to start sharing my screen again, and we'll take up the story again. Now, if you can see it, I have on screen now a form from back in World War II. It's a form that is called the Final Accountability Roster, and it's from those camps where at the end of the war, as they were closing down, they accounted for everyone who were in one of the 10 large camps run by the WRA, or the War Relocation Authority. Now, why do I bring this up at this point? It's because when we were planning for that meeting, that gathering on June the 6th in Washington, D.C., where we were going to take 125,000 cranes, place them on the fence of the White House to make a statement about what is happening today, about inclusion and exclusion, whether based on race or religion. We know that back in World War II, those two things got conflated, right? Buddhist priests were targeted. They were seen as a particular threat and so forth. And today we have travel bans that target people from Muslim majority nations. We have what's happening at the southern border around race. And if you remember from day one of this seminar, I showed you this set of images, posters and illustrations from popular magazines of the time about this Chinese invasion that would happen, and how they needed to build a Chinese wall around the United States to keep heathen people out, and so on and so forth. So that theme of exclusion from America based on race and religion, or once you're in America based on race or religion, being treated as a kind of second-class citizen, that has a long and enduring history in America, where sometimes America, it's like a pendulum, a clock, where sometimes America tends towards a narrow, exclusive point of view that seems to say, like, the only people who can really belong, who are true Americans, are, people from Europe who are white, who are Christian. And at other times, the pendulum swings the other way, where America is a generous, open nation that's multi-ethnic and multi-religious and free, where we have this other kind of vision of America. And so we have this pendulum that goes back and forth. And as I was thinking about how I could contribute to the gathering in Washington, D.C., to do something from a Buddhist point of view in the nation's capital, to bring some kind of attention to what is happening today around inclusion and exclusion on our borders, whether it be around our friends who are, from the Muslim American community, or our friends who are primarily Latinx and other people who are coming in through the southern border. We know that we want to be able to, as Buddhists, I think, be able to live in a society that is multiple rather than unitary, that is appreciative of different faith traditions, different peoples of different backgrounds with different, languages and food and so forth, that we're not about some kind of supremacist and singular vision of what reality or our society or our world should be, and that we want to instead appreciate multiplicity, diversity, and different points of view. And so with that, I was trying to think, like, what would be a great Buddhist type of ceremony or contribution to, what is ostensibly a protest. But I didn't want to do it in the kind of mimicking way of other kinds of protests. I was like, what's a Buddhist way to make a statement and express our concern? And so that's when I came up with the idea that we would try to say the names of everyone who was incarcerated back in World War II, to say the names of also people like from El Salvador, from Honduras, like other places who have died, children who have died in ICE detention, that we would actually kind of recite their names as part of a Buddhist remembrance ceremony. And I think for those of you who go to historically Japanese American temples, whatever your background, that it's quite typical to have something like Shotsuki Hoyo, or something like a monthly memorial service where, you recite some sutras, you have a dedication verse, and then you kind of name all the families or individuals who passed away that month who belonged to the Sangha, and you kind of recall their names. So that was the idea I had, was this idea of recalling names to actually utter them. And it's never been done before. It turns out that no one has ever made a list of every single person who experienced incarceration back in World War II of Japanese heritage. There's no unified list of people that were in all the different camps, including Honolulu and Sand Island in Hawaii. I mentioned the other day the Hawaii Internee Directory, which is this amazing database of people who were incarcerated in Hawaii that the JCCH has compiled. But nobody's put that list together with people who are in the Department of Justice camps, or people who went to Fort Sill and other U.S. Army internment camps, as well as all these people who were in the so-called WRA, or the War Relocation Authority camps that held roughly 109,000 people. To get to that full number of roughly 125,000 people, somebody needed to create a list. And so that became my form of activism, was just to create a list of names that we could ceremonially, in a Buddhist way, recall and remember. And so I started working with different organizations like Densho up in Seattle, the Japanese American National Museum locally here. JCCH kindly shared their database list, and working with other individuals who've been making lists, some of the National Park Service people who work at some of the interpretive centers, like at Manzanar and Minidoka and Heart Mountain and so forth, and pilgrimage committees from Poston and Tula, like different types of individuals who have also been interested in these lists and kind of compiling them and double checking names and making sure they're spelled correctly, making sure we look at internee created directories as well as government documents so that we can kind of look at them side by side and make sure the typist didn't make a mistake. And what I decided to do, just like those, when we do the Shotsuki Hoyo or the monthly memorial service, in the Buddhist tradition, we usually have, different kinds of types of booklets. And because we all belong to different denominations of Buddhism, we call them different things, but they're basically, they're like kakocho or registries of the past, where Sangha members and other people who belong and are associated with the temple are listed in this kind of booklet. And so, and they're usually listed by date of death and death date. And in the case of World War II, because we have camp survivors who are still alive, they're 100 years old, 90 years old, late 80s. We still have people born in camp who are still quite well, healthy and alive. So I decided to list everybody, not by camp or whatever, but by their date of birth. So there's been this long project I've been involved with where I'm just making lists. And I realized that in the Buddhist tradition itself, we have a history of making lists, 4 Noble Truths, Eightfold Path, 6 Paramita, like we make lists. When Ananda was trying to remember what the Buddha taught, he would often make these long lists, 12 links of causation. But it's a list and list and list and list to help us remember. Help us remember the Buddha's teachings, and in this case, a list-making project to help us remember what happened based on exclusionary ideas about race and religion back then in World War II, so that we can bring that to the present moment. And so that became this project. I've been working on it since November. I'm still working on it. It's a tedious type of project in one respect, but I just feel very karmically connected and motivated to get this done so that one day, we couldn't do it in DC, but one day we might be able to have a ceremony where no one's left out. Everybody is counted, everybody is named, and we utter their names. And so this notion of not leaving anybody out, not forgetting people, is actually something that I got inspired when I was translating that diary. I think I mentioned a few days ago the diary of Reverend Shinjo Nagatomi, the Buddhist priest father of one of my advisors at Harvard in Buddhist studies. He talks about how he would practice again and again and again the writing of the kanji, the 3 of them that you can see on this monument called the Ideto at Manzanar. Ideto, to meaning a tower or monument, and ide meaning to honor or respect, to pay some homage to the spirits of those who have died recently, but also the ancestors. And he didn't want to leave anybody unremembered. And this was something that he did in the midst of camp and in the midst of doing all those funerals and memorial services in camp. And I was inspired by his dedication to that and how he kept on practicing the kanji. Once you write those kanji in concrete, you can't mess with them. So he practiced and practiced until he felt like he got it right, and a proper monument, a tower for remembrance, was built in one of the camps. And so I've been kind of inspired by how memory works, how remembrance seems to work. And so So I'm going to come to this slide to reflect now on what is remembrance and why is it important. So I think many of you belong, unlike myself, I belong to Soto Zen Buddhist tradition, but many of you belong to either Jodo Shinshu, Nishi, or Higashi, Honpa Hongwanji, or Jodo Shu, where the word Nembutsu usually refers to the act of uttering the name of the Buddha. So Namu Amida Butsu, paying homage to Amida Buddha. But I want to today kind of recast that a little bit and think one step further than simply like, oh, this is a chant that we recite as part of our Buddhist practice. Because when we really look into what those characters Nen and Butsu mean, of course, it comes from the Sanskrit Buddha Anusmriti. So to recall or remember the Buddha, originally it was a meditative remembering or recalling of the Buddha, and then this kind of uttering of the Buddha's name. And what I want to think about is why we need to remember and recall. So if we look at even just the English word, to remember, in this case, member is meaning, the body, the corporal body. And to remember means to give, in essence, some form or body to something that is absent. And so one of the main things I think that the Buddha taught, in his own death, was that he was a teacher who taught and gave many medicines to the world. But after he disappeared, after he dies, what remains? The teachings remain, and the Sangha remains. But how do we make sure we are reconnecting with the Buddha? And how do we make sure we are bringing present that which is, in some sense, absent? And we do so by voicing into existence the Buddha, by mentally recalling the Buddha and his teachings every time we practice Nembutsu. And so I wanted to kind of throw that out there. I know it's not necessarily an orthodox Jodo Shinshu way of explaining Nembutsu, but I wanted to throw it out there as kind of like why we practice, why we have memorial services. Why do we bother with remembering Shinran Shonin or Dogen Zenji or the founders of our sect? Why do we bother remembering the Buddha? And why do we say their names? There's something very deep about that act of remembering that I think I wanted to just bring up as a set of, I have a set of final thoughts I want to leave you with in this seminar, but this is one of them. It's less like I'm making a pronouncement about this is how we should think about things, but more like a koan or a question that I wonder if we might want to dig in even after the seminar is over about why we remember, why we recall, why we say names, and why we bother to do that act of recollection and recalling. And one of the hints I wanted to give today comes from what we actually ended up doing on the date that we were supposed to be in Washington, D.C. We were supposed to go to D.C., have 125,000 cranes, and recite all the names of those who experienced incarceration back in World War II, as well as those who experienced incarceration today in recent times in Border Patrol and ICE detention facilities and died in those facilities as well. That was what the plan was. But instead, this is what we came up with. We wore masks. We we meaning there's about four, I guess there were four of us who felt comfortable enough to come back on June 6th to a temple that had been closed ever since the pandemic. Lockdown orders had been in place in the city of Los Angeles. We kept our physical distance, and we wore these masked, kind of like, it's not regular masks. They're kind of like, it's called bukusu, but there's a certain kind of like traditional Buddhist mask that's been used from like the 8th and 9th century in Japan, when we participate in special rites in, like, for example, every year when people clean the great Buddha, the Daibutsu in Nara, they put on this special mask so that they don't breathe onto the Buddha and stuff like that. It's a form of respect to put these masks on. And so we put these traditional Buddhist masks on, and we offered cranes as we chanted Juseige or Sanseige in the Higashi tradition. We were at the Higashi Hongwanji temple in Little Tokyo, and we offered cranes. Then we recited the Heart Sutra, again, as part of this kind of memorial service, a service of remembrance. And instead of reciting 125,000 names, we recited certain names from back in World War II and interlinked them with other kinds of names. I mentioned earlier around Fort Sill the name Kanesaburo Oshima, shot in the back of the neck, head by guards at the fence line at Fort Sill. It so reminded me of the neck of George Floyd, the knee on it by a police officer that led to his death. He left behind 5 children. Kanesaburo Oshima left behind 11. They are interlinked. I remembered Kino Jungo, a man who in Stockton, California, was attacked in the days after Pearl Harbor by vigilantes who felt that anybody that looked Japanese was, available as a target of their hatred, and he suffered bodily harm in these attacks. He was not the only one. Many Japanese Americans in places like Stockton and Sacramento, Los Angeles, faced these attacks from people who felt that anybody that looked Japanese was ripe for vigilantism. But I also remembered a Burmese American man, Boy Chong, who was attacked by somebody who believed that all Chinese people, or Chinese-looking people, he wasn't even Chinese, Chinese-looking people carried the coronavirus. And he was with his kids at a Sam's Club in Midland, Texas, when somebody who believed that Chinese people were carrying the coronavirus and shouldn't be out and about at a place like a Sam's Club, attacked him and stabbed him and his children in March, not that many months ago. So 1942 through 45, that war period, when we look into what happened back then, we see the echoes that's happening today. And when we look into World War II, we can also see what happened before, the Chinese Exclusion Act, those walls that went up on the ocean. We can also see chattel slavery and all of the remnants of anti-Black racism, that's all interlinked. So that's one of the reasons why I called our seminar this week Interlinked. It's not just because it's an important Buddhist teaching and it fits well with the ecology metaphor and so forth, but it's actually our lived reality as well, whether we are consciously aware of it or not. So I want to end today with a little essay I wrote. It's still a draft, but it's related to what Dexter was saying earlier about my citizenship. And this is a photo on the screen on the left. I have a mask on. I'm in my robes. I went to do my naturalization oath ceremony at the Federal Building in Los Angeles. I also participated in with some monastics associated with the University of the West. It's a Buddhist seminary east of LA. It's kind of like a suburb of LA called Rosemead, California. It's where a lot of Chinese Americans live, and there's a Chinese lineage-based Buddhist university there called the University of the West. And some of the Asian monastics there and Asian American monastics there of Chinese, Vietnamese, and Korean backgrounds organized a march, a silent march called the Great Awakening Walk that walked through Little Tokyo all the way out to City Hall silently. They were part of an organization called Buddhists for Black Lives Matter. And we did this silent walk, and I just, wanted to join them in this quiet, silent, but still powerful witness of Buddhist people saying that we are interconnected and interlinked. And so I want to read this essay that I wrote. I don't know, it might take me 5 minutes or something, or less, I hope. But it's still a draft, but it's called The Karma of Becoming American. And it's about this naturalization ceremony and how, in my mind, all of these different events seem somewhat interlinked and connected. So here I go. It's called The Karma of Becoming American. The COVID-19 safety precautions section of the Department of Homeland Security letter I received mandated face masks and banned guests at my U.S. naturalization oath ceremony. The ceremony, which took place at the Los Angeles Federal Building on June 19, 2020, was originally scheduled to be held on March 19th, the very day that California Governor Newsom issued a statewide stay-at-home order. Given fears that the virus might serve as a pretext for a complete shutdown of immigration and naturalization, it was a huge relief to find out that the ceremony would take place after all. I had imagined it would take place in a room full of people from all corners of the world, celebrating the conclusion of a long path toward citizenship together with their loved ones. Instead, when I arrived at the federal building at the appointed hour, I was told to observe the prescribed physical distance between those of us waiting in a line, marked out on the floor and taped, that inched toward the official who administered our naturalization oaths from behind a piece of plexiglass. There were only two others in line, one person in front of me, one person behind me. What this version of a citizenship ceremony lacked in scale and pomp, it made up for in an almost schematic clarity. Before the person ahead of me in line was another, perhaps not visible person who had likewise gone through this process before me. And behind the person behind me was a person who would undergo this process after me. This was a relationship that we did not arrange, but nevertheless, a line had been defined by the paths we had followed, leading us in that moment to that particular place, in relationship with each other. Because we were all wearing masks, I could only hazard a guess as to who these fellow applicants might be. In turn, they might have wondered who I was. Being an ordained Soto Zen priest, I had decided to wear robes in compliance with government directives for formal wear. But as a small but significant, and also as a small but significant way to put into practice the expression of religious freedom guaranteed by the Constitution at the very moment I pledged to support and defend it. I come from a family of entangled roots, a Japanese mother and a British father. Born in Japan, I crossed the Pacific Ocean from Japan, the country of my birth, to the United States, the country I would come to call home, 33 years ago. While I couldn't be sure how long or by what circuitous path the others waiting like me had traveled to stand before and after me in that line, the anticipation of whatever transformation citizenship entails was palpable, even behind those face-obscuring masks. Despite the physical distance between us, the invisible thread of connection, immigrants to this country, waiting for our chance to walk into a new sense of possibility and belonging, was suddenly more apparent than ever. The central truth of Buddhism is interdependence. We might not choose every aspect of how we are interconnected, but that doesn't lessen the linkage. Being interdependent means that however isolated and autonomous we might think we are not alone. That however unchanging and static we may think we are ceaselessly transforming. Even if we're masked and standing apart without friends or family in a line to become a citizen, we are simultaneously surrounded by all those who've come before us and all those who will come after us. Regardless of whether or not we are affirmed by governments as citizens, we inherit the karma of any place we have made a home in. So it made me wonder what karmic reverberations were transmitted from my naturalization ceremony having taken place on Juneteenth, a holiday celebrating the emancipation of those who had been enslaved in the United States. I realized that my new identity as an American is inexorably constituted by a legacy of delay, of radical promises of independence and freedom deferred. This is no more evident than when we understand that the news of emancipation finally reached Galveston, Texas on June 19th, 1865, 2 years after President Lincoln had signed the proclamation that had made it the law of the land. Thus, the karmic obligation of struggle. Generations of Americans have dedicated themselves to manifest equal freedom, leading up to the current wave of protesters who held the line on Juneteenth 2020 by demanding justice for Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, David McAtee, and so many others whose lives have been extinguished by police violence and vigilantism undergirded by anti-Black racism. It took former slave and abolitionist Frederick Douglass to interlink the struggle for emancipation with immigrant inclusion 2 years after the first Juneteenth. In his 1867 Boston speech on the character and mission of the United States, given amidst rising agitation nationwide against the so-called heathen Chinese that would ultimately lead to the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first federal immigration ban that targeted a particular race or religion, he made a powerful argument for America as a composite nation. Douglass's vision of the United States was one that welcomed the Chinese and immigrants of a multitude of races and faiths to the duties of citizenship, while reminding us that slave labor was foundational to the wealth of our nation, a prosperity that made the United States an attractive destination for immigrants in the first place. Douglass's vision evokes an image from the Buddhist tradition that depicts the universe as an infinite net of jewels. Each jewel has been cut in such a way that if we look deeply into the jewel, we can see all the other jewels reflected in it. Likewise, in the mirrored surface of each of these jewels, we can also see ourselves reflected. The net of jewels teaches us that we're constituted by everything and everyone around us, and that more importantly, we ceaselessly assume responsibility for everything and everyone around us. In the jeweled mirror of Juneteenth 2020, we can see the reflection of Juneteenth 1865 in both the systemic disregard for the lives of Black Americans and the struggle for transformation that has come in response to it. As a newly minted Japanese American, these mirrors also reflect the shadows of internment during World War II, when in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, Buddhist priests like myself were the first people picked up by the FBI as threats to national security. After the community leaders came the mass incarceration. Of 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of us, US citizens, into American concentration camps motivated by religious and racial animus. It didn't matter if you were an elderly grandmother or somebody who had served in the US military. The architects of the ethnic cleansing of the West Coast proclaimed that anyone with a single drop of Japanese blood, including mixed-race babies from orphanages, was subject to indefinite incarceration in camps surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. So when we look into the mirror of George Floyd, murdered by a police officer who knelt on his neck in 2020, we simultaneously see Kanesaburo Oshima, a store owner shot by a guard in the back of the neck as he longed for home at the Fort Sill internment camp fence line in 1942. George Floyd left behind 5 children, Oshima 11 children, and through them we see other children separated from their families and detained on the US southern border. And we see Johanna Medina Leon, an El Salvadoran transgender nurse and asylum seeker who died in an ICE immigration facility after being denied medical care. And when we look into the jeweled mirror of Leon, we see Bowie Chang, stabbed in a Sam's Club in Texas by a man claiming that Chinese people were spreading the COVID-19 virus. Through this interlinked American community, we also inherit responsibility. What we do matters. When Japanese Americans returned to the West Coast as the World War II concentration camps began to close in 1945, many faced lingering racial animus. In Los Angeles, they found an unexpected friend in Ray Loggins, a black business owner who ran a food catering company for Hollywood studios. While people of Japanese heritage were being refused housing and job opportunities by white landlords and employers, Mr. Loggins went out of his way to share leftover food from catering events and even offered part-time work to members of the Senshin Buddhist Hostel, a refuge for former Japanese American incarcerees who had nowhere to call home. His acts of kindness were so seared into the memories of those whom he helped that his name still resonates with them more than a half-century later. We say their names. This is because there is a lineage of American ancestors, some celebrated and others, like Roy Loggins, less well known, who have taught us that the project of emancipation in America cannot be accomplished alone, and that the journey to liberation extends across generations and communities. As I celebrate, or will be celebrating, my first Independence Day as a US citizen, I know that I'm also inexorably interlinked with Juneteenth, the other holiday of independence and interdependence, a sacred day that reminds us that America is a nation of becoming, its composition and character constantly transformed by migrations from many corners of the world. The nation's promise made manifest not by an assertion of a singular or supremacist racial or religious identity, but the actualization of an equal freedom that values multiplicity over singularity, hybridity over purity, and inclusivity over exclusivity. I apologize, everybody, that took a lot longer than I thought it would, but it was my kind of statement of what becoming American and what becoming a Japanese American and what becoming an American Buddhist meant to me as I reflected on all the things that have been happening in recent times and how they are interlinked. It's still a draft. I'm still working on it, but I thought, you know, maybe I would share this with you as the kind of last thing for this evening, just because it's my kind of like karmic connection to all of you, to kind of as probably the newest American amongst this group of people. I wanted to have something to say about how we might approach this moment in our nation's history, where there's just so much suffering. It's a time of economic uncertainty, a time of racial injustice and people struggling around that, and a time of a global pandemic. It's like all three major things, the Great Depression, the Spanish flu, and what happened during the civil rights and Vietnam War period, all happening at once. And so we live in a time with just a lot of different forms of suffering in the world out there. And I wanted to see if we can't do something as fellow Buddhists to approach all of this massive mountain of suffering. And I think we can. It's something where each one of us, if you're a lawyer, do some pro bono work for people that can't afford it. If you're a doctor and you're on the front lines anyway, there's so many ways we can all participate. And I think that there's not the Buddhist approach. I'm sorry, this session's title was, Buddhist engagement in 2020 around issues around social justice and racial justice. That it's not like there's one way to do it. I love that comment that was in the chat earlier about each one of us, depending on our karmic circumstance, have a role to play, have something we can do. And our path, as we discussed yesterday, is moving towards that North Star. We don't need to get there, and we won't do it perfectly. Sometimes we'll fall down, and we've got that phrase in Japanese, nanakorobi yaoki, 7 times falling down, 8 times get up. Our path will not be perfect. We won't know how to do things, perfectly, but we do have a guiding light that the Buddha gave to us to help us walk towards freedom and the freedom that we do it together. So let me end with that and go back to the studio, ask Dexter in the few minutes we have remaining what he'd like us to do in terms of questions that have come in. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Duncan. That was wonderful. Yeah, I'm sure that your final essay will be even, more eloquent. But thank you so much for, sharing with us, your draft and your thoughts. I know for me, this whole week has been, a journey that starts out with the, origins of Buddhism, and it brings us, up into our current, state of affairs, and expresses how we as individuals living in these times, have this legacy and are interlinked all the way back, throughout millennia, to the others that have sparkled, as jewels, and the ripples that continue from then, to now, and then hopefully how our own ripples will affect, the future. So thank you so much. There are a few questions that they're posed. I don't know if we, kind of top what your essay and closing comments were. So perhaps we should just close with a a gasho, yeah. And whatever kind of words of sincerity that each of us would like to offer.
Right. Thank you, Dexter. And maybe we can say the following: I'm for whatever reason interconnected with, interlinked with all of you who have been listening. I don't see your faces, so I can't really tell, who you are. But feel free, if you do have a question, if you go to my website, there's a way to contact me through that. So if you have questions, thoughts, comments, please feel free to continue to be interlinked and stay in touch. I'm happy to take any questions that I couldn't get to in this seminar. And maybe the way we can end is to connect with what I think we all have in common, which is our 3 treasures, our 3 refuges. I'll say it in my own style, which is the Japanese way of taking refuge. in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Namu Kie Butsu. Namu Kie Ho. Namu Kie So.
Namandab. Namandab.
Namandab.
Namandab. Thank you, Duncan. Well done.